in the Many Worlds pub. At the Tow Center, nobody nowhere appeared in the pub, ordering an empty cup of evanescent tea. It had been a good day. The theory of nothing thread had begun anew, in a more focused way, replacing the former one that had begun to weigh a ton. Michael materialized beside him, ordering Turkish coffee, noting coffee invented. Coffee plants were in the desert first seen, by a starving outcast who ate the bean, and found it bitter, hard. So, boiled some, tart. Finding that the water was the better part, coffee resented. Such from asylum he returned home quaint, and for his coffee was declared a saint, though its drinkers were despised by clerics. The partakers dallied over their cups. Michael's new assignment was in Turkey, where Thanksgiving was invented, and which, luckily, was not next to Hungary. Profat was dancing on the tables to a song about the good old days, and drinking a Singapore Sling. Neutralino enjoined order in the threads, as well as a quenching goblet mix of various molecules that easily slid all around each other. Water, the elixir of life. Greybeard downed a pint of ale made by mermaids in Atlantis. Michelle was on hand, this being her gathering, and assured that all were satisfied, while relating tales of the tow questers who had come and gone before. Kovas had a glass of ever-evolving wine and read the Tow News, which reported, "Somewhere a monk went down to the sacred pool to meditate, as always. But upon this occasion, a house containing Al-Qaeda's number 2 man suddenly blew up. Robert came in and gave everyone a new allowance of 200 privates messages. MJA ordered a drink at random, knowing that there was no difference among any of them, all of them being equal. A toast was proposed by Austin, to nothing in particular, the bird of time, fleeting time vanishes, ere the winged prize that flies in a perpetual sunrise. With the breath of eternity on its lips, time's origin is all that never dies." Rascal entered, looking happy, but covered with dust and battle stains. They all then heard his story as he imbibed some shimmering, expanding liquid. A secure-looking, unsecured tow website had been set up to lure certain conspiratorial hackers associated with some autonomous centers around the world that had thereby survived the assault of the Ninja Empire. They were after the tow, their last hope. Tracers attached to the web data had emitted a signal that pointed to a location just outside Washington, D.C., not far from the Langley CIA headquarters. Strike teams, whose only job was to be ever ready, immediately lifted off. Rascal, living in Virginia, bid her farewell and lifted off as well as the oversight for the mission. Upon landing, he ordered a missile through the front door, and then entered what turned out to be the 7 levels of hell. They fought their way through fierce resistance, melting down 6 closed bulkheads, in turn, finally arriving at the 7th, a wall of ice 7 feet thick. Finally, after hours of torching the ice that somehow continuously refroze, they found a clone of Hitler sitting on a throne, as well as one of Napoleon crowning himself. Evil reincarnated. Rascal quickly dispatched them both, left the center with a harvest of material, reported Elvis has left the building, and called in an airstrike.
Years passed. The Ninja Empire had come to operate covertly alongside some of the world's governments, and although the pursuit of terrorists seemed to be never-ending, there were still many various and glorious triumphs. What was it that was the very root of all evil? It was hard to pin down, as evidenced by a tow quest thread on that question, yet it existed and continued to sprout anew around the globe. Was it the doom of man that he could err so thoroughly and so intensely? Defenses and circumventions danced round each other in a deathly tango. Just what was this inherent malevolence in so many emotions, brain imbalances, evolutionary relics, greed, disparity, power? Earth could not answer. However, the angelic end of the spectrum was well populated too. And why was evil somewhat different on a natural or cultural level than on the personal? Evil was ultimately pointless, for it assured its own destruction. Alexander the Great, Mussolini, and so many others and their movements all came to untimely ends for their misdeeds. Yet there could be no absolute defense, for that would require eternal and infinite vigilance. Still, no extremist group had so much as crossed over the porous Mexican border to strike at US industry or even a shopping mall. Was it luck, or did they know the consequences that the diplomats had relayed to them off the record? Rascal had by now risen to the rank of Field Commander Level 8, finding the missions a complementary relief to the theoretical TOE analyses that had advanced greatly lately as the secrets of the universal DNA beginning to reveal themselves, unveiling some very counterintuitive and astounding information. Rascal was riding in a sleek black jet on a somewhat minor mission, proofreading his sequel, The New Gravity. The pilots flying at ease and granting a wide berth to the protected airspace that had just been extended for the President's State of the Union address. The war on terror predicted to have prominent mention. The Coast Guard was already boarding a freighter that had been stationary a bit too long when the ghastly glow of the Ark of Ascension lit the night. Then a second arc sprouted a few moments later and made for more frantic phone calls to the shore batteries, whose radars were already alight. Improved Patriot missiles were even on automatic and had deflected or hit the first missile at its zenith, but had missed the second. The rockets had come too fast from too close. There had been no time.
Rascal felt the plane performing a turnabout and went up to the cockpit to inquire. "The mission has been aborted," declared the co-pilot. "By Field Command? No, by Number 1 West himself." Rascal recalled the all-knowing visage of old Grand Master, whom he hadn't seen for many seasons now, and of his training by him back then, as detailed in the Butterflies at the Edge of Forever report, now buried in the closed but still readable Theory of Nothing thread. What gives? He thought as he looked out the window, seeing a sight that he never wished to see. It was the sickening arc of dissension as gravity's rainbow into the center of DC. "Look away," he cautioned the pilots, as the chain reaction turned the placid night into a light such as inside the sun. It seemed to sear the cabin. "Fly higher," he commanded. "The shockwave will be less. Then head west, for the winds will blow the radiation eastward." Turbos lifted the aircraft ever higher and away, Rascal noting the flattening of the trees below. The craft was not responding well, and was furthermore hampered by the thinning air as it struggled to gain altitude. The oxygen masks dropped after several seconds that seemed like centuries. "It's gaining on us, Rascal, sir. We're not going to make it. Both engines are now out. Radio gone. The electromagnetic pulse, secure for shock," advised Rascal. The offending waves flipped the jet end over end, and she whirled about for some minutes before they hydraulically lowered the flaps to gain some measure of stability. However, she was now a deadweight stone gliding on into oblivion, but at least one that was plummeting from on high. "That's the worst of it," said Rascal, bruised and battered, noting the pages of his book lying everywhere in the back. "Get us on a glide path out of here." Most of the electronics were out, but not all, and so they, after some 10 minutes or so, got the left engine to restart, manually, but it ran rough, for all of its checks and balances were offline. "The engine won't last long," advised the pilot as they limped on. "Not enough oil pressure." Some 20 more minutes passed. "God, that was some megatonnage!" Rascal exclaimed. "Radio's back," reported the co-pilot. "What's the defense condition status?" "DEFCON is normal, at 5. And the terror alert? Still green, as well as the redcon." "Something is terribly wrong," stated Rascal. "Had the State of the Union address begun?" "Indeed. I suppose that the Vice President, who customarily does not attend the address, was probably not far enough away." God help us all. The world will soon learn that America is defenseless. Uh-oh, answered the pilot.
Rascal asked of the jet's pilot. The other nations know. Can you check? Some moments passed. Russia, France, Israel, India, Pakistan, and the UK are already at the highest alert. It is the end of all hope. Only the president or the acting president can initiate a retaliatory strike or raise the defense condition for a suborbital attack. Although I hear that a launch is mandatory for an atomic explosion within the US. Meanwhile, on Nihao, the Grand Master had already entered the vault, having first picked up the red telephone that not only connected to the Oval Office, but to the secure cell phones of the President, Vice President, and their aides. There had not only been no answer, but alarmingly, a long incoming indication that the phones no longer existed. He carefully withdrew the secondary nuclear football from the vault, and then from its case. "Rascal," said the pilot, "we have a message to overfly Silo 19, and there is call for you. We are in fact near the silo, but how—" Rascal took the call from number 1. "We're coming up on the silo now." "What do you see?" "It's closed." "And Washington?" inquired the master. This was no small dirty bomb. It was a big one, huge, a direct hit on the Capitol complex. That's what I needed to hear, but something that I did not want to hear. "Our engine is running very hot," reported the co-pilot. "Maybe rough landing, Rascal," noted the Grand Master. "Advise me on Silo 20 just outside Richmond if you get that far. Godspeed." The call ended abruptly. The Master had a while ago picked up the blue phone to number 1 East, half a world away. She had the launch codes, yet another fail-safe mechanism that had been insisted upon by the top generals who had opposed this whole arrangement in the first place, although they had to concede that such an event was possible, and had given in. The blue phone was not connecting, the non-existent secure hub of DC thwarting the signal's approval. A cell phone call would not be considered authentic. In a few minutes she and her city might not even be there, he thought. Finally, after a required wait, the call rerouted through secure CIA lines via some obscure points on the globe. Luckily, number 1 East was there, although likely since these were her sleeping hours. Like Twin Genie, they had split day and night as well as the world. His day was her night, and vice versa. It was his watch. Halfway around the world, she jumped out of bed and raced for the control room. A brief conversation ensued, in which neither gave any hidden meanings to convey that either were under duress. She looked up the day's launch codes and relayed them promptly.
Still, the secondary nuclear transponder could not activate until it had ascertained for itself that the primary could not operate. This was accomplished through slow but sure under-ocean, mountain-eating ELF waves to NORAD and back that seemed to take an eternity due to their ultra-low frequency. Moments crawled like death worms in the desert. Would the top generals go for it? The Master, not known to be a nervous man or a smoker, picked up a cigar from his desk and lit it. He'd kept there as a constant reminder of the former and dwindling conspiracy menace, and drew in several long puffs. A seismograph clattered away, falsely indicating a 9.99 earthquake in the US capital. Much time had passed, during which he had called Rascal to double verify the bad news. He thought of Einstein's warning to President Roosevelt about the power of atomic reactions, and that Germany could develop the bomb. The president had taken the warning to heart, although Einstein himself, the man who had discovered E=mcc, had been declared a security risk, and so was never even notified of the Manhattan Project, although he did do some work on isotopes, but not really knowing why. The Master knew the drill. 12 suspect cities in the Middle East and the Orient would soon be no more, among them Damascus, Beirut, Islamabad, now run by terrorists, and yes, they had the bomb, and Baghdad, now devoid of UN troops and long overrun by Shiite extremists. Not to mention the radioactive wasteland that would remain in the mountainous region between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Satellite data would be used to track the freighter's origin, and that loophole would be closed. It was not a black and white decision, for the good would fall along with much of the bad. Furthermore, the US state governors would constitute the new emergency executive, legislative, and judicial branches of the American government, their lieutenant governors taking over in each state. Life would go on. No one would launch against an alerted US, although Israel would probably seize the opportunity to destroy Iran's new reactors. But it would go no further in the US, although the Middle East would be a mess. A report came in showing that Pakistan had gone on nuclear alert before Washington was hit. The transponder finally showed ready, and the master did what he had to do, sending the tickle that would awaken the sleeping dragon. Did it bear the pearl of wisdom, or the cinders of a once promising world? He then cut the end of the cigar and put it back on his desk as the US went to DEFCON 1. Rascal's crippled, wobbling plane overflew silo number 20. The jet's lone working engine caught fire and had to be shut down. The silo was opening.
Rascal ordered his team off the doomed jet, he to jump last, as leaders do. Each and all parachuted out the door as he took this last moment to radio his last report, that of noting the retaliatory nuclear launch from Silo #20 and that Richmond was already evacuating. The pilots would eject soon after he left the sleek Ninja jet, which had now become the silent and black angel of death. Rascal next gathered up the strewn about proof pages of his book and stuffed them into his shirt, then leapt out the door into a free fall, one more heart-wrenching than any roller coaster, in order to clear the jet and its draft, then pulled the ripcord. Many Homo sapiens would die and die this day, all over the globe, from this pretty much pre-arranged plan that had been engaged when the US Capitol complex and much of DC had been vaporized by an attack by unknown terrorists. This was evolution of a different order, not an eye for an eye, but 12 eyes for one eye. For the world's evils had reached unprecedented levels by the year 2024. Rascal floated down, steering toward a treeless area, a meadow perhaps, now seconds away from landing. A few of his book pages floated free of his shirt, but he held tight to the rest, his tome almost literally becoming a total field theory. Rascal landed. No one was about. He walked on in the dark, noting the old moon holding the new one in its arms.
50,000 years ago, Mr. Elder Sapiens, well nigh almost 30 years old, sat outside the shelter as twilight ended, noting that the moon was pale and sickly, dim and feeble, much as he felt himself. 'Twas not the best night for the hunter sapiens to be out, but the ever-present worries bred by these ancient times had won over his weariness, halting, if only for a time, his vitality from slipping away any further. The crescent was brightening as best it could, and he half slept for a while. Then a dragging noise in the bush brought him to life. They were back, hauling a carcass. If there was danger about, he would have waved them off, but there was none, so he waved them on. No one had eaten much but leaves and berries for the last 5 days, except for infant sapiens who feasted on mother's milk. Elder pointed to the dying moon and then to himself, but the younger sapiens motioned that he was fine. Many tens of millennia ago, their communication had begun, faint and ethereal, only within themselves, as symbols forming and connecting. This eventually led to gestures, preserved even to this day as when people talk, along with their hands, even while on the phone. Grunts and simple references followed. Then the basics of language. The moon set, and the Homo sapiens gathered round, friend and family, the night enveloping them, as evolution continued to sift the best from the rest, as ever it had done through death, our ancestors waning and waxing in strength. About 50,000 years later, around 1100 AD, Omar Khayyam, a rebel among the Islamics of his day, would write about the moon. About 750 years later, Edward Fitzgerald translated it into English verse. However, it never appeared in his published Rubaiyat, but had remained in his notebook. Be of good cheer, the sullen month will die, and a young moon requite us by and by. Look how the old one, meager, bent and wan with age and fast, is fainting from the sky. World government, The global ninja empire will decide whether to neutralize nuclear launches, and perhaps even the whole country of origin. A complete breakdown of all electronics will be caused by a giant electromagnetic pulse, EMP. The implications of such an event will be enormous. Phones will not work. There will be no way to find out via the internet what happened. All electricity will stop, etc.
Meanwhile, a few days previous, Frederick had taken some long overdue leave from the secret tow center to travel and broaden his mind, if not his stomach, finding himself among the prodigious Inca ruins, with the likes of Indiana Jones, perusing ancient glyphs and drinking in the scenery. Back at his hotel, while napping and dreaming in his comfy poolside lounge chair, Frederick chanced to pick up upon several whirlpooling premonitions that had eddied back into a small vortex of the future, past remembered, in a vision. One such concerned a critical and crucial clue concerning his insight of the theory of separation of fundamentals versus unification, the natural inclination, but one that was standing still, that led him onward to thoughts about some relevance of his old and nearly forgotten papers still back at his abandoned apartment condo complex. Another, more of a nightmare, showed mushroom clouds. The third, somehow related to the first, was of some general danger lurking about his vacated residence. Frederick was torn, but he needed those documents back for the tow center, to refine the theory of everything in time to prevent the flooding of the earth. For now, both of the ice caps were 1/3 melted and gone. On the spur of the moment, Frederick flew to Northern California, carrying only his emergency bag. Much of Southern California had been ablaze for months now, and recently a cyclone had killed 150,000 people in Myanmar, and earthquakes had sown in many more in China, as well as did a record number of tornadoes that had swept across the central United States. He waded through the haze of a city that still bustled, even in its wee hours, entering his old complex without much ado, having noted no one about at the rear, and headed for his storage locker near the laundry room, for this is where he kept his vault of information, not trusting it to his apartment or to the internet. It was all there. He sorted out the important papers and was off, a faint scent of gas quickening his pace away from the danger zone. Frederick soon lost himself for concealment in a mini crowd of drunks waltzing down the street, catching a dim vision of a vaguely familiar face quite a ways behind, one that he couldn't quite place. Perhaps the street wasn't the place to be, he wondered as he headed for the Muddy Waters Cafe. All were startled to hear an explosion about 2 blocks behind, Frederick noting that it had centered on his apartment. Something was certainly not right about this night, but how? Who? He'd used a tow-approved alias on the flight and had done some plastic surgery on his real credit card, cutting it in half so he couldn't possibly use it. Everyone outside stood and stared while Frederick entered the cafe and ordered a warm cup of chai to soothe his nerves. What the heck was going on? He placed his papers in a trash can for protection just as the chai arrived. He and the documents should be safe here for a time until the people outside began moving about again. After drinking of the elixir for a while, he held his head in his hands, not quite knowing what to make of this, for the CIA and the FBI were now on his team's side, and the dwindled conspiracy had been lying so very low as to perhaps be nearly non-existent. Plus, there had been his stealth.
What happened next had not been seen in his dream. As Frederick looked up, there was none other than that unplaced face approaching, that of KGB General Burkov appearing at his table and pulling up a chair. The general bore a look of astonishment, and that was probably all that would give Frederick a few more seconds of life. To be taken defenseless and unaware like this, even by some fluke after all his training, Frederick thought. But other, deeper wheels had already been turning from that same ninja training. Was the train ride enjoyable, General? Frederick asked in Russian, while unobtrusively searching for the wooden table flap levers underneath, the general's right arm tendons betraying his own reachings under the table for his trouser pocket, perhaps. "Not," came the reply, "for my precious golden train is now at the bottom of a mine shaft." "It would have been a fitting memorial for you, General." Frederick goaded as he lowered the table flap, the poisoned dart winging its revenge into it and sticking there. Frederick quickly pushed the table into the general, sliding it and him, pinning him to a wall. But the general was a sturdy man and pushed back hard, so Frederick tilted his end upwards and retrieved the dart, sticking it to the KGB man. By now, everyone had run out, and so Frederick headed for the kitchen, pulling the trash bag out of its can along the way. He put on a chef's hat and whites and went out the back, picking out his old papers and even taking the time to dump the trash into the dumpster, then went back into the kitchen to grab some tasty pastry. An astute investigator might eventually link Frederick's apartment fire to the killing of a foreign spy 10 minutes later, nearby. But all that any satellite video would show would be a cook emptying the trash and going back to work. And then perhaps that same cook or another going home where he could be interviewed later, for Frederick was now back out the rear, getting into someone's car, rolling it in neutral down a slight decline toward a dark area, for there was no key, then exiting out the other side into a bush. Maybe the police CIA satellite wasn't even around, but this was good practice, and furthermore there could be other Russians in the vicinity. Although someone with influence might have half a chance of freeing him, Frederick saw no need to enter captivity, friendly or otherwise, wherein anything could happen, and slithered, then crawled, and then eventually walked into the night, through a treed park, then through another alley, catching a bus to the airport and not a taxi, for those drivers could often remember their passengers. He would make a report when he got where he was going or along the way, and it would trickle down to the locals to exonerate him.
Frederick found a flight to nowhere, Anchorage, Alaska, where then he boarded a stopover refueling flight from New York that was going to Tokyo via Guam, where he would get off, the best he could do on such short notice. He relaxed and began to sort it all out. Could there have been some kind of signal attached to his locker? No, for it was unlabeled, and it was not the area that had blown up first. They'd thought him to be in his apartment. What was Burkov doing near the cafe? Probably oversight for his mission of retribution, and he had been astonished to see Frederick alive. Did they still want the toe information from him? No, for only the living can tell tales, and anything else of interest left in the building would not have survived the inferno, one expanded by the gas leak, which was probably just a cover. But how did they react so quickly to his arrival back home after his being gone so long? Every city has street cameras now, but they are crude, having to focus on an entire scene, and even so, his taxi had dropped him at the rear. Frederick closed his eyes and meditated for a bit. "I've got it," he thought, snapping up. Burkov, obviously a greatly unbalanced person, seething over their old encounter, had camped or lived in the area with a small team, perhaps, waiting for the day that their prey would show. But they couldn't just hang around the complex day and night for months at a time. So, there must have been a special real-time facial recognition camera or two at the front and back entrances of the unit, although such a device was almost unheard of. What lengths does a man go to for revenge? But who has that kind of surveillance technology? Only the conspiracy, yes. When their centers had been overrun by the Russians from a tip by the ninjas, Burkov had madly appropriated some of the cameras unto himself. Then a signal to Burkov, and a few minutes to confirm, or even an automatic process if he was sound asleep. Frederick dozed, finally at peace. A few hours later, the pilot announced that Guam was closed to air traffic, and so they were diverting to Hawaii. What, thought Frederick, although that was his ultimate destination. Guam can't close, for most of these Great Circle flights need it for refueling, but it's also a large U.S. military base. 20 minutes later, Frederick noted an arc in the night sky that led back down to the ocean. It could only be a submarine launching a nuclear missile, for he'd already dreamt of its effects the day before.
China had been a few minutes from launch, but thought better of it when the U.S. finally went to DEFCON 1, but not Russia, something the future would not soon forget. Ground-based radar in Australia tracked a launch to the north. "Don't let it be coming here," the tracker gasped. It wasn't. When Islamabad went up in a chain reaction, along with 11 other suspected large cities harboring terrorists, Pakistan launched on India, the only country they could reach, but who was also their old enemy for disputing their vision of the afterlife. However, India was ready, and intercepted all, then countered, and soon Pakistan was no more, as well as the mountainous region between it and Afghanistan, it being destroyed now twice over, since the US had hit it as well. Meanwhile, Israel destroyed the beginnings of yet another Syrian nuclear site, as well as all of those in Iran. Silence followed by a relative peace. The Mayan calendar had near ended, but not yet the world. Homo sapiens would likely continue, perhaps colonizing space someday, before he died off on Earth. As Frederick deplaned at Honolulu International on the Reef runway, crowded with jets without gates, and an Egyptian girl who had become very dear to him waved him toward a black helicopter. They were soon off to the bunkers of Nihao. A week or two later, a mini-nuclear winter arrived and began to restore some of the lost ice shelves. That was indeed close to a prophecy that nobody, rest his soul, had run into while lost in waves of time displacement on the CMBR trip. Perhaps some future things have already happened, destined, but only in some general form or direction. Back at the tow center, they plugged in Frederick's updated formulas. The simulation would take about a month, so Frederick and his sweetheart took off to roam the island of Paradise, albeit 3 degrees cooler in its average temperature, they building some pyramids in the sand along the way. They sat on the beach at the eastern shore of Oahu, where the road ended and turned to dirt before going off into the ocean, due to the rock protrusions. A familiar form beyond them sat in the sand and stared out to sea into the twilight, and so they ventured near. "Good evening, young Master Frederick," said the grand old man without turning around. "Hail to you, Grandmaster West. What brings you here?" "Well, I am here because of you, and you because of me." "How so?" "Well, here is a paper on which I've written what I was going to say next. So tell me then what it says before you open it." Frederick knew. "It will say, as you would have said, Frederick, as you know I've been busy lately with the nuclear crisis. But that's settled now, and so I've taken some time off myself, but I haven't forgotten you. I've read your complete and very detailed report, and would ascribe to it the fact that you went alone to spare any harm to others. And also, most significantly, because you knew yourself to be invincible in this mission. For you had seen yourself alive in the premonition of the future that had you testing your new formulas at the tow center." "Amazing," replied the Grand One. "Look to the paper now." "It is nearly word for word," said Frederick, much amazed himself. "Will the tests have a positive result? Did you see that?" "Yes, indeed they will. There is much more between heaven and earth than meets the eye.